In the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan, where death lurked behind every ridge and the enemy could strike from distances that seemed impossible, Marine Gunnery Sergeant Elena Rodriguez clutched a rifle that her fellow soldiers mocked as a relic from another era. While her brothers in arms carried the latest M4 carbines with their high-tech optics and modern accessories, Elena's weathered hands wrapped around the wooden stock of an M14 rifle, a weapon that first saw service in the late 1950s. Older than some of her grandparents. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if the story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The year was 2010, and Forward Operating Base Chapman sat like a defiant fortress carved into the rocky terrain of eastern Afghanistan's Khost province. This wasn't just any military outpost, it was a critical intelligence hub, a nerve center, where information flowed like lifeblood through the veins of America's war effort. The base housed not only Marines, but also CIA operatives, Army intelligence officers, and Afghan National Army troops, all working together in humanity's endless dance with conflict and survival. Elena Rodriguez had earned her stripes the hard way. Born in East Los Angeles to immigrant parents who had fled civil war in El Salvador, she understood struggle in ways that textbooks could never teach. Her father worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. Her mother cleaned offices at night while raising 4 children during the day. When Elena announced at 17 she was joining the Marines, her family's reaction was a mixture of pride and terror. Pride because their daughter was choosing to serve something greater than herself. Terror because they knew the costs that service could demand. But Elena wasn't deterred by fear. She was driven by purpose. Through boot camp at Paris Island, where drill instructors tried to break her spirit and failed. Through advanced infantry training, where she outshot men twice her size. Through specialized sniper school, where she learned that patience was just as deadly as precision. By the time she reached Afghanistan, Elena Rodriguez had transformed from a scared teenager from the barrio into a weapon of surgical precision. The M14 rifle she carried wasn't a choice born of nostalgia or stubbornness. It was a calculated decision made by someone who understood that in warfare, newer doesn't always mean better. While the M4 carbines her fellow Marines carried were lighter, more maneuverable, and easier to customize, they fired the smaller 5.56 millimeters round. Elena's M14 chambered the much larger 7.62 millimeters Netto round, a bullet with nearly twice the mass and significantly more stopping power. More importantly, it retained lethal energy at distances where the smaller rounds would barely sting her fellow Marines didn't understand this distinction. They saw her lugging around what appeared to be a museum piece, a rifle that weighed nearly twice as much as their modern weapons. During downtime, they'd joke about her antique, suggesting she might as well be carrying a musket. Some called it Grandpa's gun or the fossil. Elena endured their teasing with the quiet confidence of someone who knew something they didn't, that in the mountains of Afghanistan, where firefights could stretch across valleys and enemies could hide among peaks that seemed to touch the sky, her ancient rifle might be the difference between life and death. The morning of October 15, 2010, started like countless others at Forward Chapman. The Hindu Kush mountains stretched in every direction, their peaks disappearing into clouds that seemed close enough to touch. Intel reports suggested increased Taliban activity in the surrounding valleys, but that was hardly unusual. This was enemy territory, where every shadow could conceal a threat and every sunrise brought new dangers. Captain James Morrison, the base commander, had called for increased vigilance. Radio chatter intercepted the night before suggested something larger than the usual probing attacks might be coming. The Taliban had been testing their defenses for weeks, sending small groups to attack outlying positions, studying response times and defensive capabilities. It was a pattern intelligence officers recognized. The enemy was gathering information for something bigger. Elena had drawn guard duty on Tower 7, a fortified position that offered commanding views of the approaches to the base's northern perimeter. It wasn't a popular assignment. The tower was exposed, making it a prime target for snipers, and the position required absolute alertness for hours at a time. But Elena preferred it. Up there, with her M14 and a clear field of fire, she felt like she was truly contributing to her unit's survival. As she climbed the wooden ladder to her position, her rifle slung across her back, Elena noticed the unusual quiet that had settled over the valley. Even the local wildlife seemed subdued. Birds that normally filled the morning air with their calls were silent. The wind carried no sounds of distant village life, no children playing, no calls to prayer from local mosques, no bleating of goats. It was the kind of silence that made experienced soldiers nervous, the calm that too often preceded storms. Setting up her position, Elena performed the ritual she'd completed hundreds of times before. She checked her rifle's action, ensuring the bolt moved smoothly. She examined her ammunition, 20 rounds of match-grade 7.62 mm NATO, each cartridge capable of reaching out and touching targets at distances that would make other weapons ineffective. She adjusted her scope, a military-grade optic that could clearly resolve targets at ranges exceeding 800 meters. Finally, she settled into the shooting position she'd practiced thousands of times, her body becoming one with the weapon, her breathing controlled and steady. What Elena didn't know was that in villages, scattered throughout the surrounding mountains, more than 300 Taliban fighters were making their final preparations for the largest coordinated attack Forward Chapman had ever faced. The intelligence reports that had been filtering into Khost, Forward Chapman over the previous weeks painted a troubling picture, but nothing could have prepared the defenders for what was actually coming. In cave complexes and hidden compounds scattered throughout the Hindu Kush, Taliban commander Mullah Qasim had been orchestrating what he believed would be his masterpiece, a coordinated assault designed to overrun the American base and capture or kill every soul within its perimeter. Qasim wasn't your typical Taliban fighter. Before the American invasion, he had served as an officer in the Afghan National Army, trained by Soviet advisors in tactics and strategy. When the Taliban rose to power, he joined their ranks, and when the Americans arrived, he became one of their most effective adversaries. He understood modern military tactics, communications, and most importantly, he knew how Americans fought. He had studied their patterns, their weaknesses, their reliance on technology and air support. For months, Qasim had been gathering fighters from across eastern Afghanistan. Not just local Taliban, but foreign fighters from Pakistan, Chechnya, and other conflict zones who brought with them experience in urban warfare and mountain combat. He had assembled mortar, rocket-propelled grenades, heavy machine guns, and even several captured American weapons. Most crucially, he had recruited local informants who provided detailed intelligence about Forward Chapman's defenses, patrol schedules, and weak points. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its scope. 3 coordinated waves of attackers would strike simultaneously from different directions. The first wave would create chaos with mortar and rocket attacks, forcing the Americans to take cover and disrupting their communications. The second wave would breach the perimeter at multiple points while the defenders were focused on the artillery attack. The third wave would pour through the breaches, overwhelming any remaining resistance through sheer numbers. Qasim had positioned his best snipers on the high ground surrounding the base, with orders to eliminate key targets, communications personnel, heavy weapons crews, and anyone who appeared to be in command. He had studied American tactics enough to know that once you cut off their communications and eliminated their leadership, their technological advantages became meaningless. But Mullah Qasim had made one critical miscalculation. In all his planning, all his intelligence gathering, all his careful preparation, He had failed to account for Gunnery Sergeant Elena Rodriguez and her ancient rifle positioned in Tower 7. Elena had been in her position for 3 hours when she first noticed the unusual activity in the valley below. Through her scope, she could see movement among the rocks and scrub vegetation that shouldn't have been there. Small groups of men moving with military precision, carrying equipment that glinted in the morning sun. Her training kicked in immediately. This wasn't normal civilian activity. She keyed her radio to report what she was seeing, but the response from base command was frustratingly predictable. Intelligence had reported increased Taliban activity for weeks, and multiple false alarms had made everyone somewhat complacent. Yes, they would increase alert status. Yes, additional patrols would be deployed. But no, they didn't believe this was the beginning of a major assault. Elena continued her surveillance, methodically scanning the approaches to the base. What she saw through her scope made her blood run cold. This wasn't a small probe or harassment attack. Men were moving into position with heavy weapons. Mortar tubes were being set up in concealed positions. Machine gun teams were establishing fields of fire. This was a coordinated assault, and it was coming soon. She tried the radio again, this time with more urgency. Base Command, this is Tower 7. I have eyes on multiple enemy formations, establishing attack positions. This is not normal patrol activity. I repeat, this appears to be preparation for a major assault. The response was acknowledgement, but not the immediate action Elena knew was necessary. Military hierarchy and chain of command, while essential for organization, sometimes move too slowly when seconds could mean the difference between life and death. Elena made a decision that would prove crucial in the coming hours. She would stay at her post and continue gathering intelligence, but she would also begin preparing for what she knew was coming. She checked her equipment one more time. Her M14 was functioning perfectly. Her ammunition was arranged for quick access. Her radio was working, though she wondered how long communications would remain intact once the attack began. Most importantly, she began mentally cataloging targets and ranges, identifying the positions from which the enemy could do the most damage to her fellow Marines. Through her scope, Elena could see individual faces now. Young men, some barely out of their teens, others grizzled veterans of decades of warfare. All of them committed to killing every American in Forward Chapman. She noted their positions, their weapons, their apparent command structure. She was building a target list, prioritizing threats based on their potential to cause mass casualties among her fellow Marines. At 0847 hours, Elena saw the signal she had been dreading. A figure on a distant ridge raised what appeared to be a red flag. Almost immediately, movement throughout the valley changed from careful positioning to final preparation. Weapons were checked one last time. Attack positions were assumed. In compounds and cave mouths scattered across several kilometers, more than 300 enemy fighters prepared to launch the largest assault Forward Chapman had ever faced. Elena keyed her radio one final time. Base Command, this is Tower 7. Attack is imminent. I can see coordinated movement across multiple positions. Enemy strength appears to be battalion-sized or larger. They have heavy weapons and are moving into final attack positions. I estimate less than 10 minutes before contact. This time, the response was immediate. Alarm klaxons began sounding throughout the base. Marines ran to defensive positions. Heavy weapons were manned. Communication with higher headquarters was established. But Elena knew that all of these preparations might not be enough. The enemy had achieved surprise, had superior numbers, and held the high ground. The next few hours would determine whether Forward Chapman survived, or became another casualty in America's longest war. As she settled into her final firing position, Elena whispered a prayer she had learned from her grandmother, a woman who had survived civil war in El Salvador and understood that sometimes Survival depended on faith, skill, and weapons that others might consider obsolete. At exactly 0851 hours, on October 5, 2010, the mountains surrounding FOB Chapman erupted in coordinated violence that shattered the morning stillness like thunder splitting the sky. Mullah Qasim's carefully orchestrated assault began with a devastating barrage of mortar fire that rained death from above, while rocket-propelled grenades streaked across the valley like deadly shooting stars seeking American targets. The first explosions caught many Marines in transition, some heading to the mess hall for breakfast, others conducting routine maintenance on vehicles and equipment. The attack's timing was no accident. Qasim's intelligence network had provided detailed information about the base's daily routines, and he had chosen this moment precisely because it offered the maximum opportunity for casualties and confusion. Elena felt the concussion of the first mortar rounds through the wooden structure of Tower 7. The observation post shook violently, dust and debris raining down from the ceiling as she instinctively pressed herself against the reinforced wall. But even as explosions bloomed throughout the base below, her training took over. Instead of seeking cover like every survival instinct screamed at her to do, Elena moved to her firing position and began scanning for targets. Through her scope, she could see muzzle flashes erupting from positions she had identified during her morning surveillance. The enemy's first wave was providing covering fire while their assault teams moved closer to the base perimeter. Mortar crews worked with practiced efficiency, dropping rounds into tubes as quickly as they could reload. Machine gun teams raked the base's defensive positions with sustained fire, trying to keep American heads down while their comrades maneuvered for the kill. The radio crackled with desperate communications as Marines throughout the base tried to coordinate their response to the surprise attack. Contact north. Heavy machine gun fire from the ridgeline. Mortar incoming on the vehicle depot. RPG teams advancing on the east gate. I need a medic at Building 7. Elena keyed her microphone, forcing herself to speak calmly despite the chaos erupting around her. Base Command, this is Tower 7. I have visual on multiple enemy positions and am engaging. She didn't wait for a response. There wasn't time for lengthy radio conversations when Marines were dying below. Her first target was a mortar crew positioned approximately 600 meters northeast of the base. Through her scope, she could see 3 Taliban fighters working frantically to rain death on her fellow Marines. The crew was well concealed among the rocks, but Elena's elevated position and superior optics gave her an advantage they couldn't match. She settled into her shooting position, controlling her breathing as she had been taught. The M14 stock felt familiar against her cheek, the rifle's weight providing stability that lighter weapons couldn't match. Elena placed her crosshairs on the mortar crew's gunner, the man responsible for dropping rounds into the tube. She took a breath, let half of it out, and gently squeezed the trigger. The M14 roared, its distinctive report cutting through the cacophony of battle. 600 meters away, the Taliban mortar gunner collapsed, Elena's 7.62 millimeters bullet having found its mark with surgical precision. The mortar crew's fire immediately ceased as the surviving fighters scrambled for cover, but Elena was already acquiring her next target. A heavy machine gun position was pouring devastating fire into the base's motor pool, where several Marines were pinned down behind vehicles. The gun crew had established themselves in a small depression that provided excellent cover from ground-level fire, but Elena's elevated position negated their advantage. At a range of 720 meters, she placed her second shot directly into the machine gunner's center mass. The heavy weapon fell silent, but even as Elena methodically engaged the most dangerous target she could identify, the assault's second wave was beginning. Taliban fighters moved with surprising coordination and discipline, advancing under cover of smoke and suppressing fire toward the base's defensive perimeter. These weren't the disorganized militia that American forces had grown accustomed to fighting. These were trained soldiers executing a well-rehearsed plan. Elena could see the assault teams as they bounded from cover to cover, always staying low, always maintaining mutual support. Some carried explosive charges meant to breach the base's defensive walls. Others had assault rifles and rocket-propelled grenades. All of them were committed to killing every American they could find. The base's defensive systems were responding, but the coordination and scale of the attack had achieved the surprise Qasim had planned. American forces were scattered, trying to respond to threats from multiple directions simultaneously. Communication was difficult due to the noise and chaos. Some defensive positions had been damaged or destroyed by the initial mortar barrage. Elena realized that from her position in Tower 7, she might be the only American with a clear view of the entire battlefield. She could see things that Marines at ground level couldn't: the coordination between different enemy units, the timing of their advances, the locations of their command elements. Most importantly, she could see what was coming next, through her scope. Elena watched as a group of Taliban fighters approached what appeared to be a weak point in the base's northeastern defenses. If they breached that section of the perimeter, they would have direct access to the base's command center and communications hub. Worse yet, they would be behind the positions of more than 50 Marines who were focused on threats to their front. Elena tried to warn the ground forces, but radio communications were becoming increasingly difficult as the battle intensified. She made a decision that would define not only her own fate, but the survival of every Marine in Forward Chapman. Instead of waiting for orders or coordination, she would take responsibility for stopping the breakthrough herself. The lead assault team was moving fast, using smoke and covering fire to mask their approach. Elena could see approximately 12 fighters advancing in tactical formation, their AK-47s and RPGs ready for close combat. They were skilled, disciplined, and determined. But they had made one fatal mistake. They had advanced into the engagement range of a Marine sniper carrying a rifle they had dismissed as obsolete. Elena Rodriguez understood that the next 60 seconds would determine whether Forward Chapman survived or fell to the largest Taliban assault in the base's history. Through her scope, she watched 12 enemy fighters advance with tactical precision toward a vulnerable section of the northeastern perimeter. These weren't amateur militants. They moved with the discipline of professional soldiers, using smoke, covering fire, and terrain to mask their approach. The lead element consisted of 3 fighters, carrying explosive charges designed to blow a hole in the base's defensive wall. Behind them, 9 more Taliban fighters provided security and were prepared to pour through any breach the demolition team created. Elena could see their faces through her optic: young men, driven by ideology and training, committed to killing every American they could find. At ground level, the Marines defending that section of the perimeter were focused on more obvious threats to their front. Machine gun fire from the ridgelines was keeping them pinned in their fighting positions, unable to observe the flanking movement that Elena could see clearly from her elevated position. She tried again to reach them by radio, but communications were becoming increasingly unreliable as the battle intensified. Tower 7 to base defense. I have eyes on assault team approaching northeast perimeter. Grid reference. Static filled her earpiece. The radio system was being overwhelmed by traffic from dozens of units, simultaneously reporting contact and requesting support. Elena realized she was on her own. The assault team was now within 200 meters of the perimeter wall. Elena could see the demolition charges clearly: military grade, explosives that would easily punch through the defensive barriers. Once those charges detonated, 12 armed Taliban fighters would have direct access to the base's interior, where they could attack Marines from behind and potentially reach critical facilities like the command center and communications hub. Elena made a tactical decision that demonstrated why she had earned her place as a Marine sniper. Rather than engaging the obvious targets, the fighters carrying assault rifles, she would focus on the demolition team. Without their explosives, the assault would lose its primary advantage. The other fighters might be able to climb over the wall eventually, but they wouldn't achieve the rapid breach that Qasim's plan required. Her first target was the lead demolition specialist, a bearded fighter carrying what appeared to be 15 pounds of military explosives. At a range of 680 meters, with crosswinds that would affect bullet trajectory, this was a challenging shot even under ideal conditions. But Elena was operating under combat stress, with explosions detonating around her position, and the knowledge that missing this shot could result in the deaths of dozens of her fellow Marines. She controlled her breathing, steadied her position, and calculated the correction needed for wind and distance. The M14 7.62 mm bullet would take approximately 0.8 of a second to reach the target time during which the fighter could move. Wind conditions could change, or Elena herself could be targeted by enemy fire. Elena squeezed the trigger. With the smooth, consistent pressure she had practiced thousands of times. The M14 roared, its recoil familiar and manageable. Almost a full second later, she saw the demolition specialist collapse, his explosive charge scattering across the rocky ground. The assault team immediately went to ground, confused by the sudden loss of their primary mission capability. But Elena wasn't finished. The second demolition specialist was trying to recover his comrades' explosives, while the security team provided covering fire toward Elena's position. Muzzle flashes from AK-47s began sparking against the walls of Tower 7 as the Taliban fighters attempted to neutralize the threat they had finally identified. Incoming rounds cracked overhead and splinged off the reinforced walls around Elena's position. One bullet shattered a sandbag just inches from her head, filling the air with sand and debris. But Elena had been trained to operate under fire, and she knew that allowing fear to rush her shots would only result in missed targets and dead Marines. Her second shot took down the remaining demolition specialist at a range of 650 meters. The Taliban assault team was now effectively neutralized. They could continue their attack, but without the ability to breach the perimeter wall, they would be forced into a frontal assault against prepared defensive positions. Through her scope, Elena watched the surviving fighters fall back toward better cover, their mission compromised. But even as this immediate threat retreated, she could see that Mullah Qasim's assault was far from over. The first two waves had been designed to probe American defenses and create chaos. The third wave would be the main effort, a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm the base through sheer numbers and firepower. Elena keyed her radio again, this time reaching the base command center. "Command, this is Tower 7. I've neutralized the breach attempt on northeast perimeter, but I can see major enemy formations massing for what appears to be the main assault. Estimated enemy strength is 200 plus fighters with heavy weapons." The response was immediate. "Tower 7, command. Outstanding work on the breach. Can you provide targeting information for close air support?" Elena smiled grimly. This was exactly what she had been trained for. From her elevated position, she had a clear view of enemy formations that would be invisible to aircraft operating at higher altitudes. She could provide the precise targeting information that would make American air power devastatingly effective. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But as Elena began to identify targets for the incoming aircraft, she realized that Qasim had planned for American air support. Through her scope, she could see enemy fighters positioning man-portable air defense system, shoulder-fired missiles designed to shoot down helicopters and low-flying aircraft. The Taliban commander had studied American tactics carefully and was prepared to counter their technological advantages. Elena faced a crucial decision. She could continue to provide targeting information for air support, knowing that enemy missiles might shoot down American aircraft and kill their crews. Or she could use her position and weapon to neutralize the air defense systems herself, giving American aircraft the freedom to devastate the remaining enemy formations. The choice was clear. Elena Rodriguez had not earned her place as a Marine sniper by avoiding difficult decisions. She would take on the missile teams herself, even though doing so would expose her position to concentrated enemy fire and potentially cut her off from any support. As she identified the first surface-to-air missile position, Elena reflected on the irony of her situation. Her fellow Marines had mocked her ancient rifle, suggesting she was clinging to obsolete technology in a modern war. But it was precisely that weapon's capabilities, its long-range accuracy, stopping power, and reliability that now gave her the ability to single-handedly influence the outcome of the largest battle FOB Chapman had ever faced. The Taliban had come to overwhelm American technology with numbers and coordination. They were about to learn that technology meant nothing without the warrior behind it, and that some weapons become more valuable with age, not less. Elena's scope settled on the first surface-to-air missile team, positioned approximately 800 meters southeast of her tower. The two-man crew had established themselves behind a natural rock formation that provided excellent concealment from ground observation, but left them partially exposed to Elena's elevated firing position. One fighter held the missile launcher, while his partner scanned the sky with binoculars, waiting for American aircraft to appear. These weren't improvised explosive devices or crude rockets. Elena could see through her scope that they were carrying what appeared to be Soviet-era SS-7 missiles, sophisticated heat-seeking weapons perfectly capable of downing American helicopters and close air support aircraft. If those missiles remained operational when air support arrived, American aircrew would fly into a deadly trap. The range was at the outer limit of what most snipers would consider a reliable shot, especially under combat conditions. 800 meters meant Elena's bullet would be in flight for over a second, during which wind, target movement, or her own position could be compromised. But Elena had trained for exactly these conditions, and the M14's powerful 7.62 millimeters round retained lethal energy even at extended ranges. She steadied her breathing and calculated the corrections needed for distance and the crosswind that was gusting across the valley. Through her scope, she could see the missile operator's face clearly, a young man, probably in his early 20s, completely focused on his mission to kill American airmen. Elena felt no hatred toward him, no personal animosity. This was war, reduced to its most basic element: professional soldiers on opposite sides, each trying to complete their mission and protect their comrades. Elena's shot broke the morning air like a crack of thunder. 800 meters away, the missile operator collapsed, his weapon falling useless among the rocks. His partner immediately began scanning for the source of the shot, but Elena was already acquiring her next target. The second missile team had positioned themselves on a ridge approximately 750 meters to the northeast. They had heard Elena's shot and were now actively searching for her position, but the combination of distance, elevation difference, and the M14's relatively smokeless powder made her difficult to locate. Elena could see one of the fighters pointing in roughly her direction, but they hadn't pinpointed her exact location. Elena's second shot found its mark with the same devastating precision as the first. The Taliban fighter crumpled, his missile launchers skittering down the rocky slope. 2 surface-to-air missile systems neutralized, but Elena could see at least 3 more positions through her scope. The third missile team had learned from the fate of their comrades. They had taken cover in a deep depression that concealed them almost completely from Elena's position. Only occasionally could she catch a glimpse of movement or equipment, not enough for a clean shot. These fighters were disciplined and patient, waiting for the right moment to engage American aircraft. Elena realized she needed to change her approach. Rather than waiting for a perfect shot that might never come, she began engaging the position with harassing fire, placing shots close enough to keep the missile team pinned down and unable to effectively engage aircraft. Her bullets struck rocks around their position, creating a shower of stone fragments and making it impossible for them to establish a stable firing position. As Elena methodically suppressed the third missile position, she became aware that she was drawing increasingly accurate return fire from multiple enemy positions. Word of her effectiveness had spread among the Taliban fighters, and they were beginning to coordinate their efforts to eliminate the sniper in Tower 7. Bullets began striking the tower with increasing frequency and accuracy. AK-47 rounds sparked off the reinforced walls, and Elena could hear the distinctive crack of sniper rifles as enemy marksmen tried to engage her position. One bullet shattered the window just above her head, showering her with glass fragments that drew blood from small cuts on her face and hands. But Elena had trained for exactly this scenario. She had learned to operate under direct enemy fire, to maintain accuracy and composure when every instinct screamed at her to take cover. She continued to engage targets methodically, moving between different firing positions within the tower to make herself harder to locate and target. Through her radio, Elena could hear the increasingly desperate situation developing throughout the base. Taliban fighters had breached the perimeter at 2 different points and were engaged in close-quarters combat with Marine defenders. Casualties were mounting on both sides, and ammunition was running low in several defensive positions. Elena could also hear something that gave her hope: the distant sound of rotors approaching from the south. American helicopter gunships were inbound, carrying the firepower needed to break the back of Qasim's assault. If Elena could keep the remaining missile team suppressed for just a few more minutes, American air power would turn the tide of the battle. The 4th missile team had positioned themselves in a location that was almost impossible to engage from Elena's current position. They were in a reverse slope position, concealed behind a ridge that blocked most of Elena's potential shooting angles. She could see tiny glimpses of movement, but not enough for an effective shot. Elena made a decision that demonstrated both her tactical intelligence and her commitment to her fellow Marines. She left her primary firing position and moved to a different part of Tower 7, exposing herself to increased enemy fire, but gaining a shooting angle on the previously concealed missile team. The movement immediately drew concentrated fire from multiple enemy positions. Elena could hear bullets striking the wooden walls around her, feel the vibration of impacts through the floor beneath her feet. One round passed so close to her head that she felt the shock wave, but she forced herself to ignore the incoming fire and focus on her mission. From her new position, Elena could see the 4th missile team clearly. They were professional soldiers, well-trained and disciplined. They had established overlapping fields of observation and were prepared to engage multiple aircraft simultaneously. If they remained operational when the helicopters arrived, American aircrew would face a coordinated missile attack that could result in multiple aircraft losses. Elena settled into her shooting position one more time, knowing that this shot would likely reveal her exact location to every enemy fighter within visual range of Tower 7. After this shot, she would become the primary target for every Taliban fighter on the battlefield. But Gunnery Sergeant Elena Rodriguez was a United States Marine, and Marines don't abandon their missions because of personal risk. The sound of approaching helicopter rotors grew steadily louder as Elena lined up what she knew would be the most important shot of her military career. Through her scope, she could see the 4th missile team making final preparations to engage the incoming American aircraft. The team leader was scanning the southern horizon with binoculars while his gunner prepared the SS-7 missile for launch. Elena estimated she had less than 90 seconds before the helicopters came within range of the surface-to-air missiles. At their current approach speed and trajectory, the American aircrews were flying directly into a carefully prepared trap. They were depending on Elena to neutralize the missile threat. though they had no way of knowing that their survival rested in the hands of a Marine sniper armed with a rifle that many considered obsolete. The fourth missile position was located approximately 750 meters northeast of Tower 7, positioned on a rocky outcrop that provided excellent concealment and fields of fire. Elena could see both members of the team clearly now, the gunner holding the missile launcher and the spotter with binoculars tracking the approaching helicopters. Elena forced herself to ignore the incoming fire that was striking Tower 7 with increasing intensity. Taliban fighters throughout the valley had identified her position and were concentrating their efforts on eliminating the sniper who was systematically destroying their air defense capabilities. Bullets cracked overhead, struck the reinforced walls around her position, and sent splinters of wood and stone flying through the air. One round struck so close to Elena's position that she felt stone fragments pepper the side of her face, drawing blood from several small cuts. But she maintained her focus on the target, controlling her breathing and calculating the wind correction needed for the shot. The morning crosswinds were gusting unpredictably, making precision shooting even more challenging. Elena placed her crosshairs on the missile gunner's center of mass and began her final breathing cycle. Inhale, exhale halfway, hold, squeeze. The M14 roared for what would prove to be the most consequential shot of the entire battle. 750 meters away, the Taliban missile gunner collapsed, his weapon clattering useless among the rocks. The spotter immediately grabbed for the fallen missile launcher, but Elena was already working the bolt of her rifle, chambering a fresh round. Her second shot caught the spotter as he attempted to bring the weapon into action, eliminating the fourth missile team just as the distinctive whop-whop of American helicopters filled the valley. 2 AH-64 Apache gunships swept over the ridgeline like mechanical birds of prey, their pilots scanning for targets while their gunners prepared to unleash devastating firepower on the Taliban positions. Elena keyed her radio, knowing that her targeting information would be crucial for maximizing the effectiveness of the air support. Inbound aircraft, this is Tower 7. I have multiple enemy positions marked for engagement. Coordinates follow. Elena began transmitting the precise locations of enemy formations, heavy weapons positions, and command elements she'd identified during the battle. Her elevated position and hours of careful observation had given her intelligence that would be invaluable for the helicopter crews. The lead Apache pilot's voice crackled through Elena's radio. Tower 7. This is Reaper 17. Outstanding work on the missile systems. We show all air defense threats neutralized, beginning attack runs now. What followed was a devastating display of American air power precision. The Apache helicopters methodically engaged the enemy positions. Elena had identified their 30mm chain guns and Hellfire missiles, turning carefully prepared Taliban fighting positions into smoking craters. Elena watched through her scope as enemy formations that had taken hours to organize and position were systematically destroyed in minutes. But even as the helicopters wreaked havoc among the Taliban positions, Elena could see that Mullah Qasim had prepared for this contingency. Small groups of fighters were withdrawing in good order toward predetermined rally points, maintaining unit cohesion despite the devastating air attacks. The Taliban commander had planned for the possibility of American air intervention and had established withdrawal routes that would allow his surviving forces to regroup and continue the fight. Elena realized that the battle was entering its final phase, but it was far from over. Through her scope, she could see approximately 60 Taliban fighters consolidating their positions in a series of interconnected caves and fortified positions on the valley's western ridge. From those positions, they could continue to harass FOB Chapman with sniper fire and mortar, potentially for days or weeks. More critically, Elena could see what appeared to be a final desperate gambit developing. A group of approximately 20 Taliban fighters, led by a figure she suspected might be Mullah Qasim himself, was moving toward a position that would allow them to engage the American helicopters with rocket-propelled grenades when they came. And for their next attack run, the helicopters were already turning for another pass, their pilots confident that they had eliminated the primary air defense threat. They had no way of knowing that a new danger was developing in their flight path, and radio communications were too cluttered with battle reports for Elena to warn them effectively. Elena faced the most crucial decision of the entire engagement. She could attempt to engage the RPG team herself, but they were at extreme range, nearly 900 meters, and positioned in a way that would require her to expose herself completely to enemy fire. Alternatively, she could try to guide the helicopters away from the threat, but doing so might allow other enemy positions to escape destruction. The choice was made for her when she saw the distinctive flash of an RPG launch from the enemy position she had been observing. The rocket-propelled grenade streaked across the valley toward the lead Apache helicopter, which was flying a predictable attack pattern that made it vulnerable to ground fire. Elena watched in horror as the RPG detonated just behind the helicopters. Tail rotor assembly. The Apache immediately began spinning, its pilot fighting desperately to maintain control as the aircraft lost altitude rapidly. Elena could see smoke pouring from the damaged aircraft as it struggled to reach a safe landing area within the base perimeter. The second Apache immediately changed course to provide cover for its damaged partner, but Elena could see the Taliban fighters reloading their RPG launchers for another shot. If they succeeded in downing both helicopters, the air support that had turned the tide of the battle would be eliminated, and FOB Chapman would once again be vulnerable to the remaining enemy forces. Elena knew what she had to do. At a range of nearly 900 meters under combat conditions, with crosswinds and an elevated target, the shot would be at the absolute limit of her weapons capabilities and her own skills. But the lives of the helicopter crews and potentially every Marine in FOB Chapman depended on her ability to make an impossible shot with a rifle that others had dismissed as obsolete. She settled into her final firing position, knowing that after this shot, her ammunition would be nearly exhausted and her position would be completely compromised. Elena Rodriguez, the girl from East Los Angeles who had been mocked for carrying her grandfather's war rifle, was about to attempt the shot that would define not only her own legacy, but the survival of 200 of her fellow Marines. The Taliban RPG gunner was already shouldering his weapon for the shot that would bring down the second Apache helicopter. Elena placed her crosshairs on the center of his torso, held her breath, and prepared to find out whether an ancient rifle could still change the course of a modern battle. Time seemed to slow as pilgrims. Elena Rodriguez prepared to take the most important shot of her life. At 897 meters, according to her range estimation, the Taliban RPG gunner was at the absolute maximum effective range of her M14 rifle. The 7.62 millimeters NATO round would take over a full second to reach the target, during which wind conditions could change, the target could move, or Elena herself could be hit by the increasingly accurate enemy fire converging on Tower 7. Elena's hands remained steady despite the chaos erupting around her. Years of training had prepared her for exactly this moment, when everything depended on one shot, when there was no room for error, when the lives of her fellow warriors hung in the balance. She had practiced shots like this thousands of times on ranges from California to North Carolina, but those had been under controlled conditions with spotters, wind flags, and unlimited ammunition. Now she was alone, under fire, with only her skills and a rifle that her fellow Marines had mocked as a relic from another era. Through her scope, Elena could see the RPG gunner's face with startling clarity. He was a young man, perhaps in his mid-20s, with the focused intensity of a professional soldier. His finger was on the trigger of his weapon, ready to send another rocket-propelled grenade toward the damaged Apache helicopter that was struggling to maintain altitude just 1,500 meters away. Elena controlled her breathing, using the technique she had mastered during countless hours on the rifle range. Inhale, exhale halfway, hold. In that moment of respiratory pause, when her body was most stable, she began her trigger squeeze. The M14's trigger broke cleanly, just as it had been designed to do more than 50 years earlier. The rifle's recoil drove back against Elena's shoulder with familiar authority, but she maintained her sight picture, watching through her scope. As the bullet began its deadly journey across the valley, for one eternal second, the fate of FOB Chapman hung in the balance, dependent on the trajectory of a single piece of lead. Traveling at 2,800 feet per second, 897 meters away, Elena's bullet struck the RPG gunner center mass just as he was preparing to fire. The Taliban fighter collapsed immediately, his rocket-propelled grenade launcher falling harmlessly to the ground, its deadly cargo unexpended. The remaining members of his team scattered for cover, their coordinated attack disrupted by Elena's precision marksmanship, but Elena's triumph was short-lived. The sound of her rifle shot had finally given every Taliban fighter in the valley a precise fix on her position. What had been sporadic return fire suddenly became a concentrated barrage as dozens of enemy fighters turned their weapons toward Tower 7. Bullets began striking the observation post with devastating intensity. AK-47 rounds sparked off the Tofta. Reinforced walls, sniper bullets cracked through the air inches from Elena's head, and the wooden structure began to splinter under the concentrated fire. Elena could hear voices shouting in Pashto and Dari as enemy fighters coordinated their efforts to eliminate the American sniper who had single-handedly disrupted their carefully planned assault. Elena knew she had to move. Staying in her current position meant certain death, but leaving Tower 7 would eliminate her ability to provide overwatch for the base and targeting information for the helicopters. It was a tactical dilemma with no perfect solution: stay and die, or withdraw and potentially allow the remaining Taliban forces to regroup and continue their attack. The decision was made for her when a Taliban sniper's bullet shattered the wooden beam just above her head, sending a shower of splinters into her face and left shoulder. Elena felt the warm wetness of blood, but ignored the pain. She had been trained to fight through wounds, and these were superficial compared to what could happen if she allowed injury to compromise her. Mission. Elena moved to a different firing position within Tower 7, exposing herself to increased danger but maintaining her ability to observe and engage enemy targets. From her new position, she could see that the battle's dynamics were changing rapidly. The Apache helicopters, despite the damage to one aircraft, were systematically destroying Taliban positions throughout the valley. Ground forces from FOB Chapman were beginning to advance beyond the base perimeter, mopping up isolated enemy fighters and securing key terrain. But Elena could also see something that filled her with concern. Through her scope, she observed a group of approximately 30 Taliban fighters moving through a concealed route toward what appeared to be an ammunition supply point they had established before the attack. If they reached those supplies, they could resupply their forces and potentially continue the fight for hours or even days. Elena attempted to relay this information to the helicopter crews, but radio communications were becoming increasingly difficult as multiple units tried to coordinate their actions simultaneously. The airwaves were filled with casualty reports, ammunition requests, and tactical updates that made detailed communication nearly impossible. Elena realized she would have to deal with this threat herself. The ammunition supply point was located approximately 650 meters northwest of her position, within effective range of her M14, but requiring her to engage multiple targets in rapid succession. She had perhaps 6 rounds remaining in her current magazine and 1 spare magazine, 20 rounds, total to neutralize 30 enemy fighters, who were moving toward a position that could allow them to continue their assault on Forward Chapman. Tactical mathematics were stark. Elena would have to make every shot count, prioritizing targets based on their potential threat level and the weapons they carried. She would need to identify and eliminate key leaders first, then focus on fighters carrying heavy weapons or explosives. Most critically, she would need to prevent them from reaching the ammunition cache that could extend the battle indefinitely. Elena checked her weapon one final time, ensuring that the M14's action was functioning smoothly despite the debris and stress of extended combat. The rifle that her fellow Marines had dismissed as obsolete was about to be tested in the most demanding conditions possible: multiple moving targets at moderate range, under enemy fire, with limited ammunition and no possibility of resupply. As she prepared to engage the largest group of enemy fighters she had faced during the entire battle, Elena reflected on the irony of her situation. She had been mocked for carrying a rifle designed in the 1950s, criticized for clinging to outdated technology in a modern war. But it was precisely that weapon's characteristics, its power, accuracy, and reliability, that had allowed her to influence the outcome of the battle. Single-handedly, the Taliban fighters moving toward the ammunition cache had no idea they were about to face a United States Marine armed with 60 years of American engineering excellence and backed by a lifetime of training, determination, and warrior spirit. Elena's scope tracked the Taliban formation as they moved with tactical discipline toward their ammunition cache. These weren't the same disorganized fighters that American forces had grown accustomed to engaging in smaller skirmishes. These were professional soldiers, veterans of decades of warfare, moving with the kind of coordination that could only come from extensive training and combat experience. The group had broken into smaller elements of 4 to 5 fighters each, maintaining proper spacing and mutual support as they bounded toward their objective. Elena could see that they carried a mixture of weapons: AK-47 assault rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, light machine guns, and what appeared to be several improvised explosive devices that could be used against American positions or vehicles. Elena knew that if this group reached their ammunition supply point, they could resupply not only their own weapons, but also redistribute ammunition to other Taliban fighters scattered throughout the valley. The battle that had seemed to be winding down could suddenly reignite with devastating consequences for Forward Chapman's defenders. She made a tactical decision that demonstrated both her training and her understanding of battlefield priorities. Rather than attempting to engage all 30 fighters, Elena would focus on eliminating key leaders and heavy weapons operators. By removing the group's command structure and most dangerous weapons, she could render them combat ineffective even if some individual fighters survived. Elena's first target was obvious: a bearded fighter who was clearly directing the movement of the other elements. He carried what appeared to be a radio and was using hand signals to coordinate the advance of his subordinates. At 650 meters, he was well within the effective range of Elena's M14. But the shot would be complicated by the target's movement and the need for absolute precision. Elena led the target slightly, accounting for his walking pace and the bullet's time of flight. Her shot broke cleanly, and she watched through her scope as the Taliban commander collapsed. The effect on his fighters was immediate. The coordinated advance faltered as subordinate leaders tried to assess the situation and determine the source of the sniper fire. But Elena was already acquiring her second target, a fighter carrying an RPG-7 launcher and a bag of rockets. This individual represented a direct threat to American helicopters and ground forces, and eliminating him would significantly reduce the group's combat effectiveness. Elena's second shot found its mark at a range of 680 meters, and the RPG gunner crumpled to the ground. The remaining Taliban fighters had identified the general direction of Elena's fire and were beginning to take cover behind rocks and in small depressions. but their concealment was designed to hide them from ground-level observation, not from an elevated sniper position. Elena could still see most of the group clearly, though they were now stationary targets rather than moving ones. Elena's third shot eliminated a machine gunner who was attempting to set up his weapon to provide covering fire for his comrades. The loss of their heavy weapons capability was devastating to the Taliban group's tactical effectiveness. They could continue their mission, but they would be essentially limited to small arms fire against prepared American positions. As Elena worked the bolt of her M14 to chamber her fourth round, she became aware that her own situation was becoming increasingly precarious. Taliban snipers had triangulated her position and were placing increasingly accurate fire on Tower 7. One bullet struck the wooden frame just inches from her head, while another shattered a sandbag that had been protecting her left side. Elena knew she was running out of time. Each shot she fired revealed her position more precisely to enemy observers, and it was only a matter of time before one of their bullets found its mark. But she could see through her scope that approximately 20 Taliban fighters were still moving toward the ammunition cache, and some of them were carrying explosives that could be used against American positions. Elena's fourth shot took down a fighter carrying what appeared to be several improvised explosive devices. The man fell heavily, his deadly cargo scattering among the rocks. Elena's fifth shot eliminated another fighter who was attempting to rally the group and continue their advance. By now, the Taliban formation was in complete disarray. Their command structure had been eliminated, their heavy weapons were gone, and they were taking accurate sniper fire from a position they couldn't effectively engage. Some fighters began to withdraw toward better cover, while others continued to press forward out of determination or desperation. Elena could see that her marksmanship had achieved its tactical objective. The organized threat to FOB Chapman was effectively neutralized. The remaining Taliban fighters might continue to pose individual threats, but they could no longer mount the coordinated assault that could have prolonged the battle indefinitely. But Elena's personal situation continued to deteriorate. Enemy fire was increasing in both volume and accuracy as more Taliban fighters identified her position. The wooden structure of Tower 7 was beginning to fail under the concentrated fire, and Elena knew she would soon be forced to abandon her position or risk being killed by the collapsing observation post. Elena made a decision that exemplified the Marine Corps' ethos of never leaving a job half-finished. She would remain in position long enough to provide targeting information for the Apache helicopters, ensuring that they could locate and destroy the ammunition cache that the Taliban fighters had been trying to reach. Elena keyed her radio one final time. Apache gunships, this is Tower 7. I have eyes on enemy ammunition supply point. Grid coordinates follow. Large cache of weapons and explosives. Approximately 15 enemy personnel in the immediate area. Request immediate engagement. The response was immediate. Tower 7, this is Reaper 17. We copy your coordinates and are inbound for attack. Run. Outstanding work throughout this engagement. Clear the area if you can, we're coming in hot. Elena looked through her scope one last time at the battlefield that had tested every aspect of her training, courage, and skill. Taliban fighters were scattered throughout the valley, some dead, others wounded, many simply trying to escape the devastating effectiveness of American firepower guided by precise intelligence. As the sound of approaching helicopters filled the air, Elena Rodriguez prepared to abandon the position that had allowed her to single-handedly influence the outcome of the largest battle in FOB Chapman's history. The Apache helicopter's final attack run was a devastating display of precision. Firepower guided by Elena's intelligence. From her position in Tower 7, she watched as 30mm cannon fire and Hellfire missiles systematically destroyed the Taliban ammunition cache and the remaining enemy positions throughout the valley. Secondary explosions erupted as stored weapons and explosives detonated, sending pillars of smoke and debris into the morning sky. Elena finally abandoned Tower 7 as the wooden structure began to collapse under the accumulated damage from hours of enemy fire. As she climbed down the ladder, she could feel the exhaustion that came after extended combat, the physical and mental fatigue that followed periods of intense concentration and life-or-death decision-making. But even as Elena made her way to the base's command center, the full scope of what she had accomplished was becoming clear to everyone at Forward Chapman. Radio communications were filled with reports from ground units and aircraft crews describing the effectiveness of her targeting information and the devastating impact of her precision marksmanship on enemy formations. Captain James Morrison, the base commander, was waiting for Elena when she reached the command post. His face showed the strain of commanding a unit under coordinated assault, but also the relief of a leader whose forces had survived a battle that could have resulted in catastrophic casualties. "Gunnery Rodriguez," Morrison said, using Elena's informal rank, "I need you to walk me through everything you observed during this engagement. Your intelligence and marksmanship may have saved this entire base." Elena spent the next 2 hours providing a detailed debrief to intelligence officers, describing enemy tactics, weapons, coordination, and leadership. Her elevated position had given her a perspective on the battle that no other American observer had possessed, and her information would be crucial for understanding Taliban capabilities and planning future defensive operations. The casualty reports told the story of a battle that could have been far worse. Despite the coordinated assault by more than 300 Taliban fighters, Forward Chapman had suffered only 8 KIA killed in action and 23 wounded. Enemy casualties were estimated at over 150 killed and an unknown number wounded, with most of their heavy weapons destroyed and their ammunition supplies eliminated. But the numbers didn't tell the full story of Elena's contribution. Intelligence analysts would later determine that her elimination of the surface-to-air missile teams had prevented the loss of multiple American aircraft and their crews. Her disruption of the breach attempt at the northeastern perimeter had prevented Taliban fighters from gaining access to the base's interior, where they could have attacked Marines from behind and potentially overrun critical facilities. Most significantly, her targeting information had allowed American air power to achieve devastating effectiveness against enemy positions that would have been difficult to locate and engage without precise intelligence. The Apache helicopter crews credited Elena's information with allowing them to eliminate threats that could have prolonged the battle for days and resulted in far higher casualties on both sides. Word of Elena's actions during the battle spread rapidly through the American military network in Afghanistan. Stories of the Marine sniper who had single-handedly disrupted a major Taliban assault with an obsolete rifle began circulating among units throughout the theater of operations. But for Elena herself, the most important validation came from her fellow Marines at Forward Chapman. The same Marines who had joked about her ancient rifle and called it Grandpa's gun now looked at the weapon with something approaching reverence. They had seen firsthand what precision marksmanship could accomplish when wielded by a skilled warrior with the right equipment. Staff Sergeant Mike Chun, one of the Marines who had been most vocal in his criticism of Elena's weapon choice, approached her in the mess hall 3 days after the battle. "Gunny," he said, "I owe you an apology. I thought you were crazy for carrying that old rifle, but after what you did, I get it now. It's not about the age of the weapon. It's about matching the tool to the mission and the warrior to the weapon." Elena smiled, but her response reflected the professionalism that had made her such an effective Marine. "Chun, every weapon has its place in the inventory. Your M4 is perfect for close-quarters combat and urban operations. My M14 is designed for longer-range precision work. The key is understanding what each weapon can do and using it in the right situations." But privately, Elena felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond professional accomplishment. She had proven that experience, training, and skill could triumph over numerical superiority and technological sophistication. She had demonstrated that weapons dismissed as obsolete by some could still be devastatingly effective when used by warriors who understood their capabilities. The M14 rifle that had drawn so much mockery was now displayed in the FOB Chapman Armory with a small plaque describing its role in the base's defense. Marines would stop to look at the weapon and read about how Elena Rodriguez had used it to influence the outcome of the largest battle in the base's history. Elena continued to serve at FOB Chapman for another 6 months, participating in numerous operations against Taliban forces in the region. But she was never again questioned about her choice of weapons. Other snipers began requesting M14 rifles for long-range operations, and the weapon experienced a renaissance among American marksmen who had rediscovered its effectiveness in the mountainous terrain of Afghanistan. Elena's actions during the battle had also caught the attention of higher headquarters. Recommendations for decorations were submitted, and Elena would eventually receive the Silver Star, the military's third highest decoration for valor in combat, for her actions in defending FOB Chapman. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Among the intelligence materials recovered from Taliban positions after the battle, American forces found documents that included specific references to the American sniper with the powerful rifle who had disrupted their assault. Enemy fighters had developed a healthy respect for Elena's capabilities, referring to her in their communications as a significant threat to their operations. Elena Rodriguez had achieved something that every warrior dreams of but few accomplish. She had earned the respect of both her comrades and her enemies through skill, courage, and dedication to her mission. 6 months after the battle that would define her military career, Gunnery Sergeant Elena Rodriguez found herself back in the United States, assigned to the Marine Corps Scout Sniper School at Quantico, Virginia. Her combat experience and demonstrated expertise had earned her a position as an instructor, where she would pass on the lessons learned in the mountains of Afghanistan to the next generation of Marine marksmen. Elena's first class consisted of 24 Marines, all eager to learn the skills that could make the difference between life and death in combat. But Elena's first lesson wasn't about shooting techniques or equipment maintenance. It was about understanding the relationship between warrior, weapon, and mission. "Gentlemen," Elena began, standing before a display that included both modern M4 carbines and several M14 rifles. "I want you to look at these weapons and tell me which one is better." The predictable responses came quickly. "The M4 is lighter, more maneuverable, easier to customize. The M14 is more powerful but heavier and slower to handle." "It depends on the mission, Gunny," Elena smiled. "That last answer is the only one that matters. There is no best weapon. There are only weapons that are best suited for specific missions, terrain, and tactical situations. Your job as Marines is to understand the capabilities and limitations of every weapon in your arsenal, and to choose the right tool for each job." Elena's teaching methodology was revolutionary in its simplicity. Rather than focusing solely on the technical aspects of marksmanship, she emphasized the mental discipline and tactical thinking that separated effective snipers from mere shooters. She taught her students to think like hunters, to understand their prey, to be patient and precise rather than quick and flashy. In Afghanistan, Elena would tell her classes, "I carried an M14 rifle that was older than my father." Other Marines mocked it as obsolete, called it a relic from another war. But that rifle saved the lives of 200 Marines during a single engagement. Why? Because I understood its capabilities and used it in situations where those capabilities were exactly what the mission required. Elena's students learned not just marksmanship, but battlefield intelligence gathering, target prioritization, and the kind of tactical thinking that allowed a single sniper to influence the outcome of major engagements. They studied her actions, at FOB Chapman as a case study in how individual skill and proper equipment selection could overcome numerical disadvantage and enemy coordination. The story of Elena's defense of FOB Chapman had spread throughout the military community and beyond. Military historians began studying the engagement as an example of how individual initiative and expertise could influence the outcome of much larger battles. The action was used in staff colleges as a case study in defensive operations and the proper employment of precision marksmanship assets. Elena was most proud of the practical impact her story had on weapons procurement and training. The M14 rifle experienced a renaissance in American military service as commanders rediscovered its effectiveness in long-range precision applications. New variants were developed and deployed, combining the weapon's inherent accuracy and power with modern optics and accessories. More importantly, Elena's example influenced a generation of military marksmen to think more carefully about weapon selection and employment. Rather than automatically gravitating toward the newest and most high-tech options, shooters began to consider which tools were best suited for their specific missions and operating environments. Elena's Silver Star citation, read at a ceremony attended by her family and fellow Marines, captured the essence of her contribution for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an armed enemy while serving as a sniper with Marine Forces Afghanistan. Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez's extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty reflected great credit upon herself and the Marine Corps, and were in keeping with the highest traditions of the Marine Corps and the United States Naval Service. But for Elena herself, the real satisfaction came from knowing that her actions had saved lives and contributed to mission success. She had proven that experience and skill could triumph over superior numbers, and that weapons dismissed as obsolete could still be devastatingly effective in the right hands. Elena retired from the Marine Corps after 22 years of service. But her influence on American military marksmanship continued. Former students who had learned from her went on to become instructors themselves, passing on her lessons about the importance of matching warriors to weapons and weapons to missions. The M14 rifle that Elena carried during the battle for FOB Chapman was eventually donated to the National Museum of the Marine Corps, where it stands as a testament to the enduring relevance of proven designs and the warriors who wield them. The museum's display includes a detailed account of Elena's actions during the battle and the lessons that can be learned from her example. Elena returned to East Los Angeles, where she established a foundation to help disadvantaged youth develop the discipline and focus that had served her so well during her military career. She often spoke to school groups and community organizations, sharing her story and emphasizing that success came not from having the latest equipment or technology, but from developing the skills and character necessary to excel with whatever tools were available. "I carried an old rifle," Elena would tell these audiences, "and people laughed at me for it. But that rifle didn't save 200 Marines. I did, using the training, discipline, and determination that the Marine Corps had given me. The weapon was just a tool. The real weapons were up here." She would tap her temple. "And in here," pointing to her heart. Elena Rodriguez had learned and taught one of warfare's most important lessons, that technology is never a substitute for skill, training, and warrior spirit. In an age of increasingly sophisticated weapons and equipment, she had proven that sometimes the oldest tools, in the right hands, can still change the course of history. Her legacy lived on in every Marine who understood that victory belongs not to the side with the newest equipment, but to the warriors who can make the best use of whatever weapons they carry. The impact of Elena Rodriguez's actions at FOB Chapman extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. Within weeks of the battle, military analysts throughout the Department of Defense were studying the engagement, trying to understand how a single Marine sniper had managed to neutralize such a significant threat with equipment that many considered outdated. Colonel Patricia Williams, a Pentagon analyst specializing in small arms effectiveness, was among the first to recognize the broader implications of Elena's performance. What Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez accomplished challenges some fundamental assumptions about modern warfare, Williams wrote in her classified report. She demonstrated that in certain tactical situations, older weapon systems may actually be superior to their modern replacements, particularly when employed by highly skilled operators who understand their capabilities. The report sparked intense debate within military circles. Some argued that Elena's success was an anomaly, a unique combination of circumstances that couldn't be replicated. Others saw it as evidence that the military's rush to adopt newer technologies had sometimes come at the expense of proven systems that still had significant utility. General Robert Mackenzie, who commanded Marine forces in Afghanistan, ordered a comprehensive review of sniper equipment and tactics based on Elena's AAR after-action report and the lessons learned from Forward Chapman. The review would ultimately result in significant changes to Marine Corps sniper training and equipment procurement. We cannot allow our pursuit of technological advancement to blind us to the continued effectiveness of proven systems, Mackenzie stated in a memo to his staff. Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez's actions remind us that the warrior behind the weapon is always more important than the weapon itself, but we must also ensure that our warriors have access to the tools that best suit their missions. The review led to several concrete changes in Marine Corps' policy. First, the M14 rifle was officially reintroduced as a designated marksman weapon, with improved variants being distributed to units operating in terrain where long-range precision fire was critical. Second, sniper training was modified to include instruction on a broader range of weapon systems, ensuring that Marines understood the capabilities and limitations of different platforms. Perhaps most importantly, the review established new guidelines for weapon selection that emphasized mission requirements over technological novelty. Unit commanders were given greater flexibility in choosing weapons for their Marines, with the understanding that older systems might sometimes be more appropriate than newer alternatives. Elena's story also began to influence training at military schools beyond the Marine Corps. The Army's Sniper School at Fort Benning incorporated her engagement at FOB Chapman into their curriculum as an example of how proper weapon selection and superior marksmanship could overcome tactical disadvantages. Navy SEALs and Air Force Special Operations personnel studied her actions as a case study in precision engagement and battlefield intelligence gathering, but the impact of Elena's story extended beyond military circles. Defense contractors who had been focusing exclusively on developing newer, more technologically advanced weapons began to reconsider the market for improved versions of proven designs. Companies like Springfield Armory and Fulton Armory saw increased demand for modernized M14 variants, incorporating contemporary materials and manufacturing techniques with the weapon's proven design. The civilian shooting community also took notice. Elena's story resonated with competitive shooters and hunters who had always appreciated the M14's accuracy and power, but had seen it overshadowed by more modern designs. Sales of civilian M14 variants increased significantly as shooters sought to own rifles similar to the one that had performed so effectively in combat. Elena herself became an unwitting spokesperson for the idea that newer wasn't always better. She was invited to speak at military conferences, shooting competitions, and industry events, where she consistently emphasized that weapon selection should be based on mission requirements rather than marketing claims or technological fashion. I didn't choose the M14 because I was nostalgic for an earlier era, Elena would explain to these audiences. I chose it because its characteristics, long-range accuracy, stopping power, and reliability match the requirements of my mission better than any alternative. The key is understanding what you need to accomplish, and then selecting the tool that best enables success. Elena's influence on military thinking extended to other areas beyond small arms. Her example prompted reviews of other equipment categories, where newer systems had replaced older ones without thorough analysis of whether the change represented a genuine improvement in all tactical situations. The Navy began reconsidering some of its electronic warfare systems after realizing that older, simpler technologies were sometimes more resistant to enemy countermeasures than their sophisticated replacements. The Air Force examined whether some of its legacy aircraft might be more suitable for certain missions than newer platforms that were designed for different threat environments. Elena's story also influenced how military leaders thought about personnel assignments and training. Her success had come not just from her weapon choice, but from her deep understanding of that weapon's capabilities and her extensive training in precision marksmanship. This realization led to new emphasis on specialized training and the development of expertise in specific systems rather than broad familiarity with many different platforms. The Marine Corps established new weapons specialists positions that allowed Marines like Elena to develop deep expertise in particular systems and then share that knowledge with other units. These specialists became valuable resources for commanders who needed to understand how different weapons could be employed most effectively in various tactical situations. Elena's legacy was also preserved in more tangible ways. The Marine Corps established the Rodriguez Prize for Excellence in Precision Marksmanship, awarded annually to the Marine who demonstrated the most outstanding performance in long-range shooting competitions. The prize included a modernized M14 rifle similar to the one Elena had carried at Forward Chapman. More significantly, the Corps established the Tactical Weapon Selection Course at Quantico, where Marines learned to evaluate different weapon systems and choose the most appropriate tools for specific missions. Elena served as the course's first director, bringing her combat experience and analytical approach to the challenge of educating the next generation of Marine leaders. The course curriculum emphasized critical thinking over rote memorization, teaching Marines to analyze mission requirements, environmental factors, and enemy capabilities before making equipment decisions. Students learned to question assumptions and challenge conventional wisdom when it conflicted with tactical reality. Elena's approach to teaching reflected her own journey from a young Marine who had been mocked for her weapon choice to a combat veteran whose example influenced an entire generation of military professionals. She encouraged her students to think independently, to base their decisions on analysis rather than peer pressure, and to have the courage to choose tools that might be unpopular but were tactically sound. The enemy doesn't care whether your weapon is fashionable, Elena would tell her students. They only care whether it can kill them effectively. Your job is to ensure that it can. Elena Rodriguez's story resonated far beyond military circles, because it spoke to universal themes that touched people from all walks of life. In an age of rapid technological change, where newer was automatically assumed to be better, Elena's example challenged conventional wisdom and reminded people that experience, skill, and understanding often mattered more than having the latest equipment. The story of the Marine who saved 200 lives with an ancient rifle became a metaphor for the enduring value of proven methods and the importance of matching tools to tasks rather than following trends. Business schools began using Elena's story as a case study in decision-making, illustrating how thorough analysis and deep understanding could lead to choices that seemed counterintuitive but were ultimately more effective. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a professor at Harvard Business School, incorporated Elena's story into her course on strategic decision-making. Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez faced the same challenge that business leaders encounter every day. Mitchell explained to her students, she had to choose between what was popular and what was effective, between following conventional wisdom and trusting her own analysis. Her choice saved lives because she understood her mission requirements better than her critics. The story found particular resonance in the technology industry, where companies often felt pressure to adopt the newest platforms and methodologies without thoroughly evaluating whether they represented genuine improvements over existing systems. Several Silicon Valley executives began referring to Rodriguez moments, situations where older, proven technologies might actually be more appropriate than cutting-edge alternatives. Elena's influence extended into unexpected areas. The medical community began discussing how her example applied to treatment protocols, where newer drugs or procedures weren't always superior to established methods that had proven effective over time. Dr. James Patterson, a veteran emergency room physician, wrote an article titled "The M14 Principle in Medicine," arguing that doctors should base treatment decisions on patient needs rather than the allure of new technologies. Elena Rodriguez chose her weapon based on mission requirements, not marketing materials. Patterson wrote, "As physicians, we should choose our treatments based on patient needs, not pharmaceutical company claims or medical fashion. Sometimes, the old ways are still the best ways." The story also resonated with educators who were grappling with the integration of technology into classrooms. While digital tools offered new possibilities for learning, Elena's example reminded them that traditional methods, books, lectures, hands-on practice still had significant value and shouldn't be abandoned simply because newer alternatives existed. Elena herself became increasingly aware of how her story was being interpreted and applied beyond military contexts. She began speaking to civilian audiences, sharing her insights about decision-making, critical thinking, and the importance of matching tools to objectives rather than following trends. "The principle isn't specific to weapons or warfare," Elena would explain to business audiences. "Whether you're choosing equipment for your factory, software for your office, or methods for training your employees, the same logic applies. You need to understand what you're trying to accomplish, analyze your options thoroughly, and choose the tools that best enable success, regardless of what's fashionable or popular." Elena's speaking engagements took her to corporate boardrooms, university campuses, and professional conferences where her military experience provided credibility for her message about thoughtful decision-making. She developed a reputation as someone who could help organizations think more critically about their choices and resist the pressure to adopt new systems, simply because they were new. Her message was particularly relevant in an era when organizations often felt compelled to keep up with technological trends, without fully understanding whether those trends served their actual needs. Elena's example provided a framework for evaluating options based on merit rather than marketing, effectiveness rather than excitement. The Rodriguez principle, as some began calling it, became shorthand for the idea that the best choice wasn't necessarily the newest or most popular option, but rather the one that best matched the specific requirements of the situation. This principle found applications in fields as diverse as architecture, where some projects benefited more from traditional construction methods than cutting-edge techniques, and agriculture, where certain crops grew better using established farming practices than experimental approaches. Elena's story also inspired individuals who felt pressure to conform to popular choices in their personal lives. Young professionals who faced criticism for using older equipment, driving reliable used cars instead of new models, or choosing established career paths over trendy alternatives found encouragement in her example. The broader message of Elena's story, that substance mattered more than style, that effectiveness trumped trendiness, that individual judgment could overcome peer pressure, resonated with people who had ever felt out of step with prevailing wisdom. Her example provided validation for those who trusted their own analysis over popular opinion. Elena's influence on decision-making extended to military families as well. Spouses and children of service members began applying her principles to their own choices, whether selecting schools, choosing career paths, or making financial decisions. The idea that careful analysis and understanding of requirements should drive choices became a family value in many military households. Perhaps most importantly, Elena's story encouraged critical thinking in an age when people were often pressured to make quick decisions based on limited information. Her example demonstrated the value of taking time to understand options thoroughly, analyzing requirements carefully, and having the courage to make choices that might be unpopular, but were ultimately more effective. Elena's legacy was thus much broader than her military accomplishments. She had provided a model for thoughtful decision-making that applied across disciplines and situations. Her story reminded people that wisdom often lay in understanding fundamental principles rather than chasing the latest trends, and that the courage to make unpopular but correct choices was a valuable trait in any field. The girl from East Los Angeles who had been mocked for carrying an ancient rifle had become a symbol of the enduring value of critical thinking, careful analysis, and the courage to trust one's own judgment even when it conflicted with popular opinion. 20 years after the battle at Forward Chapman, Elena Rodriguez's influence on military thinking and beyond continued to shape how people approached complex decisions and equipment choices. Her story had become more than just a tale of individual heroism. It had evolved into a teaching tool that helped organizations and individuals think more critically about the relationship between tools, tasks, and outcomes. The Marine Corps had institutionalized many of the lessons learned from Elena's example. The service's approach to equipment procurement now included formal requirements to consider whether existing systems might be adequate before pursuing new developments. This Rodriguez review process had saved millions of dollars by preventing unnecessary replacements of effective equipment and had ensured that Marines received tools that were genuinely superior rather than merely newer. Elena herself had continued to evolve professionally after her retirement from active duty. She had earned a doctorate in military history from Georgetown University, writing her dissertation on the evolution of small arms tactics in irregular warfare. Her academic work provided scholarly foundation for the practical lessons she had learned in combat, and she became a respected voice in defense policy circles. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, as she was now known in academic circles, served on several Pentagon advisory committees that evaluated weapon systems and tactical doctrine. Her unique combination of combat experience, analytical ability, and academic credentials made her a valuable resource for military leaders who needed to understand how theoretical concepts translated into battlefield reality. But Elena's most lasting contribution might have been her influence on how the military educated its future leaders. The principles she had demonstrated at Forward Chapman, critical thinking, thorough analysis, and the courage to make unpopular but correct decisions became core elements of military education at all levels. The Naval War College, the Army War College, and the Air War College all incorporated Elena's story into their curricula, not just as an example of tactical excellence, but as a case study in decision-making under pressure. Officers learned to question assumptions, analyze requirements thoroughly, and choose solutions based on effectiveness rather than popularity or technological sophistication. Elena's influence extended to international military education as well. Allied nations sent officers to study her methods and incorporate her principles into their own training programs. The Rodriguez method of tactical analysis became a standard approach taught at military schools in countries ranging from Australia to Norway to South Korea. The civilian applications of Elena's principles continued to expand as well. Business schools now regularly taught case studies based on her example, and management consultants often referenced her story when helping organizations make strategic decisions about technology adoption, process improvement, and resource allocation. Elena had also become a sought-after speaker at technology conferences, where her message about thoughtful evaluation of new systems resonated with audiences grappling with rapid technological change. Her talks challenged the assumption that newer technologies were automatically better and encouraged more Careful analysis of whether new tools actually improved outcomes or simply offered the appearance of progress. Innovation is valuable, Elena would tell these audiences, but only when it solves real problems better than existing solutions. The goal should be effectiveness, not novelty. My rifle was 50 years old when I carried it into combat, but it was still the most effective tool for my mission. Your job is to find the tools that work best for your mission, regardless of when they were developed. Elena's personal life had also flourished after her military service. She had married Dr. Michael Chun, a military historian she met while researching her dissertation, and they had 2 children who grew up understanding the importance of critical thinking and principled decision-making. Elena's parenting style reflected the same analytical approach that had served her so well in combat. She encouraged her children to think independently, question assumptions, and make choices based on careful consideration rather than peer pressure. The rifle that had made Elena famous was eventually displayed in the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History, where it served as a centerpiece for an exhibit on the evolution of military technology. The display included interactive elements that allowed visitors to understand the decision-making process Elena had used when choosing her weapon and the tactical considerations that made her choice so effective. Thousands of visitors each year learned Elena's story and gained insight into how thoughtful analysis could lead to choices that seemed counterintuitive, but were ultimately more successful. The exhibit became particularly popular with school groups, whose teachers used Elena's example to discuss critical thinking, problem solving, and the importance of understanding requirements before selecting tools or methods. Elena's story had also inspired a new generation of women to pursue military careers and leadership roles. Her example demonstrated that success came not from conforming to expectations, but from developing expertise, thinking independently, and having the courage to make unpopular but correct decisions. Military academies reported increased interest from young women who cited Elena as a role model and inspiration. The Elena Rodriguez Leadership Institute, established at her alma mater in East Los Angeles, provided scholarships and leadership training for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. The Institute's programs emphasized the same principles that had guided Elena throughout her career: critical thinking, thorough preparation, and the courage to choose effectiveness over popularity. As Elena approached her 60th birthday, she reflected on how her single decision to carry an M14 rifle had created ripple effects that extended far beyond anything she could have imagined. What had started as a tactical choice based on mission requirements had become a symbol of the enduring value of critical thinking and principled decision-making. Elena's legacy lived on in every Marine who questioned conventional wisdom and chose equipment based on capability rather than fashion. It continued in every business leader who rejected technological trends that didn't serve their actual needs. It persevered in every student who learned to analyze problems thoroughly before selecting solutions. The girl from East Los Angeles, who had been laughed at for carrying an ancient rifle, had taught the world that wisdom often came from understanding fundamental principles rather than chasing the latest trends. Her story would continue to inspire future generations to think critically, choose wisely, and have the courage to trust their judgment even when it conflicted with popular opinion. Elena Rodriguez had proven that sometimes the oldest solutions, in the right hands and applied to the right problems, could still change the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.